there's a feature on the Aston Martin, everyone will go, well, they're so slow, why would you copy them? But they've got a really interesting feature on their T-Trace
Mm-hmm.
support that is unlike any other team.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
they may have the best porpoising solution, but it doesn't make them the fastest car.
Right. That's right.
So, yeah,
True. Hello. Welcome back to F1 Fanfiction, a show about race weekend reviews and race community interviews. This episode is about the Austrian Grand Prix, and if you've not read the title yet, oh my god, it's gonna be a banger because we've got a celebrity on the show this time. We are your hosts. I am Akash.
And I'm Sarang.
And I am Craig Scarborough, F1 journalist.
That's being modest, Craig.
That's
being
really
modest.
underplaying it, I guess.
That's kind of what I do. I could just call it F1 fan, would be probably more accurate. But yes,
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we've got Craig Scarborough in the house, Scarbs Tech, Scarbs F1. Just look him up. If you've not heard this name, you're missing out on some serious great tech stuff. And if you're a geek and a nerd like us, oh damn, you gotta check him out. Into the race, Scarb, I want to get your opinion first. What was your favorite moment of the race?
Oh, I don't know actually. I mean, I think probably the one thing I was reminded of it this morning is we actually saw quite a lot of overtaking, and particularly in the midfield. And then there was that one point where there was like 5 cars abreast going through corners. And it was like watching a Moto3 race in MotoGP. It was like, this, well, first of all, technically it shouldn't be possible.
Yep.
But then equally, then you think, well, this must end in tears. And it didn't. It was like, wow, Formula One is very different in 2022, isn't it? The cars can get so close.
Yep.
I think we've been rewarded, certainly these past 2 races with 2 obviously very good circuits, really delivering fantastic racing. And Formula One's all the better for it.
Definitely. True. Sarang, for you?
I think for me, it's definitely has to be Alonso wagging his finger at Tsunoda. I think that was a classic Alonso moment that we got out of this race.
True.
I don't think I can ever forget it.
No, you don't pull that cheekiness on me. Sure. For myself, I think it was like that one Marshall. And I say this jokingly, but I mean it in no joking way. But like that one Marshall who got the fire exhaust, he dropped it on the tarmac of the road, just pulling up to Sainz's car, and then went somewhere. I'm like, he probably just noped out of the whole situation, just looking at how the car was. But in all seriousness, like that other Marshall who actually stopped the car for Sainz to get out of that moving car because for some reason it wasn't able to brake. Just some brilliant stuff there. So yeah. With that, I just wanna lead with some stats for yesterday. It was Ocon's 100th GP, and he also climbs up in the driver championship table at P8 with 52 points, overtaking Bottas at 46. Yesterday, Verstappen still tied with Alain Prost's number of wins at the Styrian Grand Prix. Mick finishes his career best, 6th place, ends up getting driver of the day. For some reason, that was a lesser of a highlight for some reason. I don't know. Hamilton's gone 12 races without a win, the longest in his career that we know of. And Niki Lauda still remains the only Austrian to win on this track.
Interesting.
So that's some stats. Scarb, you probably may know. I'm sort of putting you under the light here, but any stats that stand out for you for the Styrian Grand Prix?
To be honest, I very rarely kind of go back and look at the stats because knowing some of the people that put these together, it's you can make stats out of just about any fact. I mean, actually, probably the one that you mentioned there is actually realising where Ocon had got to this year, up to 8, and stepping past Bottas. That caught my ear because I found it quite surprising because I thought this year has been very disappointing for LP.
Yeah.
And I know Ocon has certainly been the more consistent, the more lucky, should we say, of the 2 LP drivers. So I guess that's just reward, but it just it's strange that it surprises me that he's got P8. It's
Right.
been a tough year for them.
True. And do you think like Alonso's sort of getting better at forming these trains? Because it looks like, I mean, we've seen this over so many races now. That one Alpine is always forming the trains, and then the other Alpine is charging through the field, as you rightly mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly a strategy that they've all agreed, and that you could see someone with Alonso's broad view of a race weekend and what's necessary to get points. There's almost a kind of a lack of ego, which seems counterintuitive when you speak of Alonso. But he's found a way of executing the race that really does give him a great opportunity to get those points in when all the other factors around him allow him to. So it's interesting. I don't think it's a sustainable model, and really they should have more pace in that car. But it's kind of working for him, and it's certainly given us some great entertainment.
For sure. I think Alonso, or I think Alpine in general, this season has been doing pretty decent. But of course, like they've been having technical issues overall. I mean, they haven't been able to convert it to points. But still, I think there's a lot of potential here, especially looking at how well Alonso is able to, overtake other cars and, even block other cars, in fact, from overtaking him. So I think it's just a matter of Alpine trying to, getting better reliability, I guess, and then they can probably, go ahead. Unfortunately, I think for Alonso, it hasn't worked out that well as it has for Ocon, but let's see. He still is providing us a lot of entertainment. So,
the highlight, I think, yesterday for me, again, like I'm switching gears now here, but finally Charles is able to get out of his bad luck streak, I'd say, because it's like maybe Binotto sort of like envisioned this with his famous, that frame that's gotten captured now. And this was like, this is coming for you in Styria, and like he got his reward.
Is it really broken though? I mean, he somehow was limping across the finish line.
He wasn't without his bad luck, was he? With his throttle pedal sticking open, which is anyone that's had the mat in their car stick to their pedal is like trying to win a Grand Prix with Max Verstappen just 2 seconds behind you. It's pretty stressful. But yeah, I mean, I think Ferrari. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how much this Ferrari pace continues. We've seen it over the past 2 races. Obviously, Silverstone was a particularly odd race because of strategy and lots of other reasons. Austria, I think, is the first time we've seen since early season that Ferrari had a kind of a clear advantage. And it'd be interesting to see if they are able to maintain this high top speed, which, they were able to go with, but equally with that, better tyre management. And probably for the majority of this season, that has been the opposite, where Red Bull has had the better tyre management, they've had the greater top speed in the race, and been able to bring them two together. And I think for the first time, we've seen it switched around. So this could be maybe not a turning point, but certainly a kink in the road of the championship, just to see if Ferrari can now come back at Red Bull a little bit more, albeit that they do have reliability problems, which goes much further than the throttle pedal, as we saw with Carlos Sainz.
Fair enough.
The throttle was really scary though. I mean, when I first heard him saying on the radio that his throttle is not, disengaging entirely, I'm like, wait, what? So basically he is at 300 miles per hour going into these corners with around 20% of his throttle always on. Wow, that's, I can't imagine racing and finishing the race that way.
Yeah, it's I don't know what mechanism he used to actually control the excess throttle, whether if he puts the foot on the brake somehow it offsets that, or if it is literally just braking against the engine to try and get the car stopped. But it's one of those things. Some drivers are so much better at coping with something very unusual happening. Some drivers like the car to be perfect, or they like to be coached through the problem. And you could see there that clearly Charles just understood what the issue was and just drove around it. He was telling the team, but there's not much the team could have done about it at all, really. It's something that they can, you can't just turn the throttle pedal sensor off because the car will just grind to a halt. So, yeah, it was a tricky situation. But again, that overcoming things like that is what builds you up to becoming a world champion. simply just pulling to the side of the circuit or going flying off on a corner, as some drivers may would have done. Just shows that there's an element of class in his driving that we've seen a few times this year.
Yeah, that too. Like he's probably like I'd still call him like the next generation driver on the grid. So that's beautiful to see someone who's still learning the ropes of climbing up, getting so good with the adverse situation. Obviously now you can explain us better, Scarb, on what actually was happening, because on the radio what we heard was the revs were still high because of the event that we just discussed, which because of some algorithms was affecting downshifts of gears on Charles's car, and he wasn't able to downshift. What's more to the meat here on what was happening under the car's hood?
Well, the main problem that was happening is that the throttle pedal doesn't have a cable like you have with your old road car going straight to the engine. It has two sensors in it, which means that in order for the pedal to come back up to its resting position, I can't do it that way, you have a spring behind it. It almost looks like a little mountain bike shock and spring behind. And either something happened in the bearings in the pivot, or more likely in that spring damper. And rather than it coming back to the closed position, it was coming back to like a 20% off of closed. That's an issue. And it means that he was going into the corner with some of the engine still wanting to push onwards, which you can brake against, and you can kind of try and carry a bit more corner speed and choose how you're working, but it is difficult. But then the other problem that you have is within all of the software that the car runs against, there's all these safeguards to stop drivers doing something silly like going in 8th gear, suddenly changing down to first or something. So because the ECU was detecting that the throttle was on, says, well, you can't down change now. That's not the situation I'm expecting. So I'm going to ignore that downshift request, which means he was then obviously struggling to get a downshift done at all. And these cars, while they have lots of torque and you have the hybrid systems helping with that torque, you really still do need to be able to shift down in order to still maintain a reasonable pace around those last few laps.
Interesting. One thing I thought about while watching this going down in general was it that the characteristics of this track kind of helped Charles a bit? Because since this track comparatively doesn't have as many slow corners, think about this happening probably somewhere in Monaco or something. I think it would be a lot more difficult to manage it over there than at Austria, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of those, because it's such an open circuit, and as you say, there's a limited. You probably could get around this circuit a bit like Schumacher did back in the 90s by just staying in one gear and just driving it. So it did help. And you're right, if this was a different track, then he probably would have lost that position. Indeed, probably crashed before the end of the race.
Because you mentioned Monaco, I'm thinking like, imagine him going with this issue into the hairpin. That's a no.
That's a big no from me.
Yes.
Oh man. Well, talking about things blowing up, let's talk about Carlos's engine, I guess.
Oh God, poor him, man.
Yeah. It's interesting. So there's lots of people asking me before the race, because Austria is at altitude, not massive altitude, but it is, I think, some over 500 meters above sea level. The air's that little bit thinner, and they were asking me the problems that it causes. One of the problems that it causes is it makes the turbocharger spin much faster because the air's thinner. In order to get the power, you've really got to get that turbocharger up to its maximum speed, which is 125,000 RPM, which still kind of blows everyone's minds when you hear it. So I suspected that if there was a problem with the Ferrari turbo, it would be here, and then again maybe in Monza and obviously Mexico, which would probably be the worst case. Because we saw Charles have a problem with his turbo in Baku, which is a very similar kind of circuit where you're on the throttle full speed for long periods. Now, we've had no word from Ferrari, so this is just my assumption of what happened. But I think the turbocharger failed again on the car because of the way the smoke came out, because of the type of fire that you had. Even the bodywork, you saw the air being released from the intercoolers and stuff with the fire started. I don't think it was actually a problem within the V6 engine. It was probably just mainly limited to the turbocharger. So Ferrari do have a weakness in this area, which is worrying, because you've got lots of races coming up that will really challenge it. but they can make reliability changes to that turbocharger before those races, and they're allowed to do that, even though the engine is kind of design frozen until the next 4 years. But it's a concern that both the top two teams really have been struggling with reliability, and perhaps highlights the fact that Mercedes have got so close to them in championships.
Yeah.
Because they've had so many DNFs, and it's really unusual for two leading teams to have so many failures over the first half of the season.
Yeah, that's true.
Fair enough. It's interesting to see how Mercedes is bringing that three-way fight actually into the whole mix here. We heard Carlos's radio say Strat E or Plan E, and then immediately I forget if it was Crofty or Brundle or whoever it was on the radio on the commentary, and they said he's blowing past A, B, C, D already. Cut to his car is actually gonna blow up, and I'm like, oh, this commentator's curse is going to a whole new level at this point.
Oh yeah.
The point there really for me is just the level of preparation the teams therefore have, and the memory that the drivers can have in obviously a stressful situation, trying to remember what E was compared with the other ones. It's one of those things. I'm sure it becomes much more natural when you've been doing so many races already. What we've had, this is 11th this year.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, it just shows how much the teams have to plan for every eventuality. Is there going to be a high deg race? And it certainly was a high degradation race.
Yes.
Is there going to be safety cars? And how are our competitors doing against us? So yeah, they have to go all the way down to E to find what they thought would be the perfect strategy.
True. But which is also interesting because it's a very interesting argument that's going on the internet with quote unquote Ferrari clowns at this point because of all the strategy mixes up. But then we hear this conversation where they're planning all the way to a plan E and going and running through all these scenarios. So even when we think that they messed up on simplest of the situations, these strategies are so difficult to pan out, and it just goes bonkers at times.
Yeah, no, I was trying to think that through the races that I've seen, I think this is kind of unique with Ferrari that they have these many strategies. Oftentimes we have heard about, plan B or something with other teams, or we're going to pit early, something like that. But only during the Ferrari radios, I have generally noticed that they have a lettering system and they often use it thoroughly. They do go far into the letters quite a while. And I don't know, somehow it always brings up the image in my mind that the drivers have a cheat sheet inside the car where they're quickly checking what the letter is. But yeah.
On the note of the fight that is going on with these Ferraris, Max and Leclerc were going head to head. At one point, Max totally gave up on that fight and he let Charles pass. But after a pit stop that happened around lap 33-ish, there was this interesting radio message which Scarbs, I want to get your insights into. Is he says one lap there was a good front grip, and then the next lap he didn't have anything. The car's getting pretty unreliable. How does lap over lap it vary like a sine wave? Because either you have a good one and then it just goes bad, but it seemed like yesterday it was good, bad, and a complete jambalaya of things yesterday.
Yeah, that was particularly unusual in Max's case, and certainly he found that car was very inconsistent, which is the worst thing you want when you're a driver, particularly when you want to be pushing. And at a circuit that would punish you as much as Austria. If you go off there, you're kind of really going off into the scenery. I think there's a couple of things. First of all, you may look at the actual consistency of the tyre, which would be the first thing, which has been a criticism pointed at Pirelli in the past. I doubt that was really what was going on here, something, in the manufacturing of that set of tyres that it was running. Also, you had the wind, which was a factor in certainly the crashes during, if I get that right, qualifying. The sprint weekend. I forget exactly what point that was.
Yeah,
right. Messed up.
I think it was qualifying, yeah.
It was, yeah, it's the two Mercedes anyway. So, changing wind will suddenly make you go from, having lots of front downforce to having no front downforce. So that's a factor as well. And I think that just kind of goes to show just how much on a knife edge that Red Bull is to get the performance. You know, it's been in some respects a very consistent car because it's been quick all year long, and they're always kind of right in there unless there's some kind of reliability or penalty problem. But if you see Max, who can kind of cope with a car that is inconsistent and isn't ideal to drive, compared with Perez, who prefers a car to be much more predictable through the course of a race so that he can get his kind of super long strategies played out. You can just see how the nature of that car compares between the two drivers and how they can exploit it in different ways. So this weekend it was a bad one for Perez. It was almost a great one for Max, but Max seems to be able to deal with his car being on his knife edge all the time. Although he does complain on the radio, as you say, about that.
Yes, for sure.
I mean, and again, I say this in a joking way, but like, as soon as Perez dropped off to P20, I felt like it was again going to be one of those moments where Perez knows if he drops down to the table, he stands on the podium. So I was like, maybe this is going to be one of those Perez comebacks.
Sadly, it didn't turn out.
Tough luck.
Well, since we are on the topic of Red Bull and Ferrari, I think let's talk about the flex floor drama that's going on overall. So, like, my understanding basically is that, like, F1 is bringing in a new technical directive from, I think, the French GP, I guess, if I'm not wrong. And basically, it is to address two things. From what I understand, one is that some teams are apparently using disappearing skid block on their like, what's that called? Floor, right? Yeah, underbelly, right? Yeah. And also, Red Bull and Ferrari are using like a two-piece floor plank, which kind of gives them a little more flex on their center part of the car. So, Craig, kind of want to get your, your opinion on this as to, just enlighten us.
Okay, so I think you're right. The technical directive has come out. We've had a number of these actually, changing ever so slightly. I think they come into force for the Belgian Grand Prix now. It's been pushed back a bit further. Okay. And it does all kind of relate to how close the floor is to the circuit and how the teams are coping with that in different ways. Now, with these current cars, what you really want to do is get the car as close to the floor as possible to kind of get the edge of the floor against the track, really get those ground effect tunnels working. The problem that produces is porpoising and bouncing, as we've seen kind of for most of the year. As soon as the car's close to the track, if it hits a bump or if the aero stops working, then it just starts going up and down, and that really wrecks the car's performance and the driver's health. So how do you get around that? Well, there's various ways you can get around porpoising. There's suspension, there's changing the shape of the aero. But one of the things that the teams have done is actually change how the floor hits the circuit. And they've done this in a number of ways. And of course, the plank and the skid blocks underneath the floor have been there since, 94, and have been there to stop teams dragging the car along the track, or having the floor impact the track. So if you can flex that middle section where the plank is of the floor in different ways, you potentially get closer to the track. And if you do kind of hit a bump or, the car does get to the point where it hits the circuit, it doesn't hit something rigid and it hits something flexible. So that won't set off the porpoising as much as others. Now, everyone's pointing their fingers at Red Bull and Ferrari. I don't think that is wholly correct.
Okay.
Because there's lots of other teams that have got some similar designs from what I can see, particularly in the front, which we call the T tray, where you're, if you normally would be the thing that would hit the track first. Certainly last year when the cars were running like this, it was that front bit of floor that would hit the circuit first. But now, because the cars are so much flatter, the back of the floor can hit the circuit as well.
Right.
So there's all sorts of sort of flexibility tricks there. There's also ways of actually making the edge of the floor bow downwards. Actually making a seal with the floor where you want it to, but not where you don't want it to. And that accusation could be pointed at teams other than Red Bull and Ferrari. So it's tricky to kind of point the fingers. And to be honest, none of us know. I'm certainly the FIA don't know who is doing what. I think the only exception to that is the thing that came up over the weekend, which I hadn't heard of in the paddock, was this disappearing skid block, which is quite interesting. So normally you would have the floor of the car, you'd have the plank underneath it, and then you would bolt these titanium skid blocks, things that make it spun, up underneath, and that holds the plank against the car and prevents the plank wearing away. Well, it seems as though they've done it the other way, so that the skid block goes in underneath. So if it hits the track, it gets pushed up.
Great.
So the skid block won't wear away, the plank won't wear away. You can actually lean on it a bit more. And this practice could easily have predated this season, because if teams were doing that at the front of the floor last year, it would have been a real advantage. But that seems to have been, it's one of those quite easy mechanical things to work out. Once you've seen the floor and the parts in front of you as a scrutineer, you think, no, you can't. That's not how we wanted it. Change this. And again, we don't know the team that's doing this. It could be a team right at the back of the grid that, we don't see the benefit from. So be careful when you which teams we're mentioning here. But it's a problem across the grid.
Right.
And I think it does need to be cleared up, because the regulations were ambiguous. They're still ambiguous. The technical directive doesn't cover everything that I know about that's on the cars. And I think they just need to kind of go through that entire area, straighten it out, and then start enforcing it. And we'll go back to, hopefully, everyone making the best of their cars without pushing the rules.
Interesting. That's actually very well put, because it's always these front runners that get mentioned in these sort of conversations. But like Haas, unfortunately, it was Zhao's accident which sort of put all of this into the limelight when the car was dragging on its head. But it seems like you're right. Like the whole grid is doing it, and nobody sort of cares about what's happening.
Absolutely. There's a feature on the Aston Martin. Everyone will go, well, they're so slow. Why would you copy them? But they've got a really interesting feature on their T-Trace support that is unlike any other team. So they may have the best porpoising solution, but doesn't make them the fastest car.
Right. That's right.
So, it could be the Williams, it could be, Sauber, Alfa Romeo are doing very well, but they don't have some of these clever tricks on the car that I can see. So it's like, well, I think a lot of it is just the media kind of whipping it up into a Mercedes versus Ferrari versus Red Bull.
I think it's also like the curse of being at the front. Like whenever you are succeeding, people are gonna try and bring you down. So I think it's kind of a part and parcel of that as well.
That's part of the always been part of Formula One history. Every time a team suddenly elevates itself to the front of the grid, almost immediately they'll detect something. So Benetton was a classic. Benetton had been in Formula One for a number of years without really having success. Suddenly you had that, early 90s spell when they were really just getting it done. And then everyone's suddenly thinking, and then all the attention. And, it carries on with all the teams that, kind of make that step upwards. It's the nature of competition, I guess, that people point fingers at someone that's suddenly doing better, beating you. On
a lighter note, because you mentioned Benetton in the 90s, I mean, I see the Styria Grand Prix and I see like it's such a simple layout, but it's such a complicated track because you have like so many avenues of oversteer, and we saw that yesterday with like cars running off. Many got penalties, many got the flag. What I'm getting to is, in the 90s, we had this famous, the anti-roll bar, right? Which helped sort of with that adjustment of steerings, with either the front or the back, and you could adjust your steer. Have the cars gotten so much more sophisticated, or would you like to see maybe like the anti-roll bar sort of thing coming back at such high speed Grand Prix?
Well, the anti-roll bar adjuster, as you say, was banned in '94 as part of the active suspension and driver aid thing, which seems a very strange thing to do. But they thought that was it. Lots of race cars have got adjustable anti-roll bars, adjustable by the driver, not by a little lever in the cockpit. I can see no reason that they couldn't come back as manual adjustments or even electronic adjustments, as long as it wouldn't be changing the anti-roll bar for every corner. Like you would have with brake bias or differential control. I wouldn't mind that. But to be honest, in lots of respects nowadays, the balance of the car is adjusted through the differential on the gearbox rather than with the systems that they had previously. So I don't know how useful it would be. I think teams would have to do some simulations and see if it really would pay off. But there is actually probably now more than ever stuff that the driver can do to actually adjust the car's balance on the go from the cockpit that was never available to the drivers pre-94.
Okay. Interesting.
All right. I guess let's get back to the race a little and let's discuss a little bit about the awesome battles that we saw. I mean, there were battles pretty much everywhere yesterday. And of course, like we cannot forget, of course, Scarbs, you mentioned that the battle royale that we saw between Alonso, Zhou, Mick, Norris and K-Mag at lap 26. Wow, that was something to marvel at. I mean, it reminded me kind of 2 years back or 3 years back at Spa, where I think there was 5 wide going into, right after the Kimmel Straight. This was nice. I think this year with the new regulations, we can see that they're working. We can see closer racing. We can see that cars are not getting affected as much by following other cars. And, I'm just glad to be watching F1 during this time, very honestly. Especially after the years that have been in the last few years where racing was not kind of very interesting at points. But, right now it's just too much fun.
Yeah, no, again, it's interesting. A lot of the drivers didn't say much about the new rules and the ability to follow closely during testing. In fact, some of them were actually quite negative about it. There's been no improvement. But we've seen consistently this year that, if someone wants to go right behind another car, they can do so. And that then leads to either errors, like you saw when Schumacher initially got past Hamilton. Hamilton had gone wide and Mick was close enough to actually monopolise on that without, I don't know if he did have DRS, but it was, effectively, it wasn't DRS that allowed that pass. And I think that's great because I think as a fan in a 1.5, 2 hour Grand Prix, I think you want to be able to think that someone might be able to overtake. I think that is, that jeopardy, that it might happen is what kind of keeps us on the edge of our seats. Now, I think if we literally just saw everyone just pass everyone straight away, I think the sport would be a lot duller. But, and, you still get an element of that with DRS, particularly this weekend with 3 zones picking up so well for cars that could carry that little bit more top speed. I still understand the need to keep DRS, but I just wish you didn't have almost unlimited use of it. You could be behind someone for every lap of a race and have it every lap. And that just doesn't seem fair. I think it needs to be, maybe you have so many DRS applications available through the whole weekend. So, if you want to use it in qualifying, you use it in qualifying, but you'll have less in the race.
That's
or something like that, just to make it a bit more tactical rather than, just a free pass, just to say, well, I'm going to try and overtake you on the straight. Which, particularly when you've seen the leader or someone that's been in a great positional race, someone then comes up and just gets all these opportunities just to breeze past on the straights, and it kind of kills, particularly towards the end of the race when that's like there's no coming back from it. So I think we've made some improvements. I think Formula One still maybe needs to follow up these regulations with some other sporting and technical changes just to really nail the racing.
That's an interesting one because I think after Saudi we made that adjustment where Australia we were gonna have 3 DRS zones, but we made an adjustment and we only eventually saw 2. But I've not seen this side of a take on where you essentially Ferrari ends up creating a plan G for all we know, where you can only limit your number of DRSs. That's a very interesting take. And is this a chatter that's also going on in the paddock, or it's still just some people talking?
No, I mean I think for the FIA, yes or no DRS. I don't think there's any talk about playing with the sporting rules around it. I know this is employed in some other categories. For the life of me, I can't remember. I know I've seen graphics on TV before. It's something that I've kind of touted for many years, and it doesn't seem to have gained any traction anywhere with anyone else. So it's just an idea rather than something that maybe we might see in the next few years.
Interesting. I think like with all the battle royals and the close racing that we've been talking, something interesting that also ended up happening yesterday was a battle between the Haas and Stroll particularly. I feel like Stroll yesterday was particularly on the top of his game, because earlier, I mean, he might be racing good, but there wasn't much footage or coverage he got during the race. But yesterday, because without the pit stop, he climbed, I think, all the way up to P4 at one point, and that just got like him in the limelight there, and especially some brilliant back and forth overtakes with, I think it was K-Mag, but I could be wrong, and it could be Mick. That was something brilliant too.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the Aston Martin is a far better. Everyone says it's a better race car than it is a better qualifying car. Because of the way it deals with its tyres. And equally, you can see for someone like Stroll, there's certain types of circuit that he seems to excel at, which tend to be the much more wide open, really stretch the race out things. He always runs very well at Monza and some of the other sort of fast tracks like that. But equally, although it's Aston Martin, in our heads, it's still Force India.
Yeah.
And,
yes.
A lot of the people on the ground are still the Force India people, the people that are, Andy Stevens and Tom McCulloch and all of that, doing the strategy, doing the sporting side of it. They know how to get a race result out, a bit like it is with Alonso at Alpine. They know that they can find a way of getting a setup on a car and the tyre strategy to get you that result at the end of the race. And Stroll really has been kind of delivering that. As you saw, in particular Austria, and no doubt will be again in a few races in the future over the year. And it's not all about just how good the car is. It's about that the team around it and how they plan to go racing. Because you probably wouldn't have seen Stroll getting those results if he'd gone for a more conventional setup and a conventional strategy.
Right. Yeah. Right. There's this other thought that I've been having because you mentioned Alonso, which is we have these veterans, right? Like Vettel is obviously feeding the data back to their team, which is helping Aston Martin grow. But then how much of it is a back and forth between what Vettel is feeding back versus some of these folks who've been around with their team since like Force India, right? So how does that camaraderie work behind the garages? Because we never as audience get to see what's happening, so some insight there from you, because you might have seen some of these things happen.
Yeah, it's interesting when you chat to the engineers, and I don't tend to talk to them a lot about drivers or even race engineering, to be honest. But when you do speak to them, or you listen to all the various podcasts where they do get a bit of time to talk and how they understand a driver, and part of their job is to understand what the driver wants out of the car, get how it works, how it feels. But equally, in the driver explaining what he wants, they learn stuff. It's not unusual that you would see a test driver at Red Bull. I'm thinking of the Russian whose name's escaped my head now. I've said that is picked up by Ferrari, and they do that because they debrief them. They understand about all the little strategies and all the little bits of software and all the little methods that they use in a team in order for them to learn. And it's this churning of information around the paddock, which allows teams to keep getting better and better. And also is a way of finding out how people are kind of not cheating, but certainly stretching regulations and rules as people move about. So it's a key part of it. The first thing anyone will do from going from one team to another is to have a really big debrief about what the other team were doing. And that's, completely up board, and that's part of the reason you're hired, isn't it? Let's face it, your experience. And then, all those other little thoughts that you then bring to the team as you change teams really allows them to move forward. So certainly have someone like Vettel on board, looking at the drivers that Aston Martin, Racing Point, Force India, all their other names have had over the years. Vettel really is kind of one of the biggest stars that they've had back in there. So they will have learned, and no doubt lots of their practices will have changed because of the feedback that Seb has given them.
Interesting. Great insight. So one thing I wanted to kind of point out before we move on to the other topics was, and I saw this a lot on internet as well. Of course, we saw some great racing by Mick overall in this race, and a lot of people have pointed out that suddenly it seems like something inside Mick has suddenly turned on, and he's just gotten into the form, right? Like what we're seeing from the last race. And it matches up exactly with his career in F3 and F2, where he spent his first 1.5 year trying to understand the car, and then suddenly from there on, his season just changed. And I think that's exactly what's happening again here as well. It's exactly 1.5 year, and we are suddenly seeing that he's performing really well. It's really funny to see that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't tend to watch a lot of the racing in the junior categories. I'll be honest, but I speak to all the people that do follow them, and I'm always trying to work out how good are some of these drivers coming up. And certainly Schumacher, sometimes a big name can actually be bad because you're kind of elevated above your talent. But I think everyone suggested that Mick was there on talent alone. Not just his surname, although I think maybe the Ferrari link is almost inescapable. And I mean, if you can see, that Haas car hasn't changed. That much is definite. It's not that they've suddenly put a new floor on it and it works for him. So maybe he has just worked out how to get the best from that car. Maybe he's just one of those drivers that's slower. Certainly his dad, Michael Schumacher, was someone that could kind of get into any car. And drive it. I'm sure if when he was having success at Ferrari, if he'd gone out, for lunch and come back and they'd changed all of the settings on the car, he would. Well, for a start, he would probably be able to tell you exactly all of the changes and how big they were. But then still drive the car immediately as quickly. Some drivers need more time. Some drivers need to bed in. Obviously, last year you can almost discount for Mick from a point of view of fast driving because the car was just so bad. So this is the first year where they've had a good car that he's been able to learn and understand and now start to exploit. So maybe, your point is it stands up there and that that's just the way he goes racing, which is interesting, but also then makes you think about his future career. It doesn't sound like a driver that needs to be jumping from team to team,
right?
Every couple of years. I think he's someone that would certainly benefit from some stability in the team and literally the group of people around him as well. And maybe that's what gets the best out of him. But certainly, his racing over the last two Grand Prix has been fantastic. As good as anyone else out there, which is, nice because, we all have a soft spot for Schumacher, whether you was a big fan of his or not. I think it would be a shame that if his son came in and really just kind of faded out after 2 years. I think in our hearts, I think we all want to see some success there, just to see a bit of the old Schumacher there. So I think that's great.
True.
Thanks.
And on the same note, the other name that I wanted to get some of your insights on is Zhao, because coming in there was all of this again media attention of I don't want to sort of like put it in any negative way, but like a pay driver of some sort, right? Like, because he came in with money, blah, blah, blah. Let's not go there. But point being, he came into his rookie season. And for us here at F1 Fanfiction, he's blown our minds off, like with the way he's been driving. How has like the overall environment been at the paddock? What are your thoughts on Zhao? And does he stand up to the way we've sort of started thinking about him?
Well, he's one of those people that really, I speak to people that follow the things, and this Chinese guy. I've done a lot of work with Chinese media over the years, and I've always been kind of a bit of a head on the upcoming names. And while he was an upcoming name, it was never kind of flagged that he could be really good. Not to be rude to him, but there are other drivers in junior categories that maybe shine a brighter light than he has. But he's come into the Alfa Romeo team. They've put out a very good car. He's got someone like Bottas as a teammate. And as you say, he's performed. He's not come in and played the understudy to Bottas. He's not come in, made lots of big rookie errors like maybe Tsunoda has. He's got results. He had that obviously huge accident, but was back in the paddock an hour later, apparently quite calm, lucid, talking to everyone. Has given lots of interviews about it almost immediately after and over the Austrian weekend, and still put in, apart from reliability issues, a great weekend in Austria. So, where does the future go for him? I think, we're almost more certain that, Zhou will be in Formula One and in a good position for the next handful of years. Meanwhile, the Alfa Romeo Sauber team, I think I've got less confidence in where they're going to be next year and what they'll be called and what engine they're going to have in the car.
That's true.
But yeah, certainly, I think they've got a really great package there with the Ferrari engine, the chassis, Bottas and Zhou all together. And it's nice because they've had some tough years over in Hill, and it's nice to see that they've really kind of tackled these regulations really well.
Yeah. All right. Let's switch gears a bit. There's one question that I kind of wanted to ask Craig was, and I found this pretty interesting. So I noticed that in the previous race at Silverstone, Charles had damage on his front wing end plate, and he pretty much was not affected by it almost at all because he was driving pretty well. I mean, he gave up a good fight, but the same thing what we saw yesterday in the Austrian GP was that Russell also had a similar damage, but he seemed to be suffering from it a lot more, and he had to instantly come into the pits to change his front wing pretty much. So I think what I'm trying to get at is this is a two-part question. One is that why is the difference? I don't understand because at least in the Silverstone GP, the commentators were saying that the front wing end plate with the new aero kind of is not playing that much of a major role as it used to. So, kind of wanted to get your opinion on that.
Okay, yeah. So I didn't actually see the damage to Russell's car, I'll be honest, but it wasn't the same as what happened to Leclerc. So Leclerc had the end plate, the big vertical piece on the end of the wing. Now, under any previous year in Formula One, certainly over the past maybe 10 years, losing that vertical bit would have been a big impact on the way that the wing works, because fundamentally what it's trying to do is to try and keep the high pressure above the wing, the low pressure below, so it creates that downforce, that pressure differential. But the way they've changed the regulations this year, they've almost kind of negated the function of the end plate, even though they're much bigger. Because they kind of roll under the wing now, they do very little actually in separating that airflow. It's too easy for air to go under the wing already, which is why you don't see steep wings in front of it. You can lose that, but it is much less influential. He probably lost probably more drag because it coped with the way the airflow goes over the wing, than he probably lost in downforce. But he would have had a small, there is, let's not deny it, there is an impact. I think Ferrari said 5 points of downforce, which is not a massive amount to really change your race, but certainly it's something the driver would feel. If Russell had, and again, I don't know the damage, but it wasn't the end plate, so it was probably something more on one of the 4 wing elements. And that is much more sensitive. So if he had, if the gap between those elements closes up or opens up, then the wing really stops working. And that means you lose downforce in a big way. So that's a much more sensitive area of the wing. Just like in the old days, you used to get a loser barge board. And, if the driver was fired up, like, again, we go back to Schumacher, don't we? Could actually drive faster. Max last year or the year before? Yeah. Was it last year? Yeah. Yeah, because obviously half of the performance of the car is in the driver's head. So yeah, some parts of the car are really sensitive, and others aren't. And it's just luck of the draw, how you hit someone and what bit breaks and what bit doesn't.
Interesting. Well, while we were talking about these changes, right? Like of late, we've seen notable changes on probably all constructors making to the side belly of their car. The side pod sort of changed overall across the grid. But beyond that, what sort of like that one innovation that stood out for you for the car evolving over the past 12 races for you?
Really, I mean, a lot of the sort of the innovation this year has been people starting to follow other people's ideas. For me, the most interesting thing of all this year that's been a success has been the Ferrari side pods. When I first looked at them, something didn't seem right about their design. I couldn't understand quite what they were doing because it was quite unconventional. If you look at Red Bull or Alpine, AlphaTauri, they were kind of what I drew as my prediction for the season. And then you come to Williams with the original side pods, which made no sense to me at all. It's like I can see what they were trying to do, but And in fact, the more I understood what they were actually doing, the less I understood it. It just seems like it never made any sense. But then you look at the Mercedes solution, which is similar, but you could see that was much more developed as an idea, and it works very well, other than the other issues they're having. So I think for me, people changing. So Williams have obviously gone to a much more conventional sideboard now. Alpine have taken aspects of Ferrari and Red Bull's sideboards. I think all these sort of changes are the things that really kind of interest me. We're seeing lots of little detail, as you say, on the edge of the floor, on the entrance to the floor. That's, detailed stuff that's very hard to kind of completely understand how it's working. But I think this year, as it would normally be in a big year of regulation changes, is, it's the big obvious things that we're going to see change a lot. And I think as we see the cars launch next year, I think we're going to see a lot more similar looking cars than we did this year. They may fall into two camps. People may go for a Mercedes or more of a Red Bull Ferrari solution. And I think both could work. Just as we've had high rake and low rake or short wheelbase, long wheelbase, anything else. So yeah, I think that's really is. There hasn't really for me been one little feature that really kind of wowed me. It really has been just like in the big thinking, which tends to come into how you're dealing with the side pods and the cooling packages and stuff like that.
Interesting. Okay, I have to ask this, and I think this has kind of become a meme all over the internet, and the term "sticky up a bit" that Sam Collin loves to use. Two-part question here. So, A, what's your opinion on that? And B is, what's like leading from there to the next question is, what's the challenge in being a science communicator overall, and how do you strike a balance between dumbing down the topic, but at the same time trying to maintain the technical aspects of it?
Well, I mean, I think you actually your question answers itself in lots of respects. I worked very closely with Sam. I've known Sam for years and years before we started doing stuff on Tech Talk. We've got Albert Fabrega, Spanish journalist, who again I've not worked with, but we always sit and chat in the pit lane, and we'll always kind of get something. And he has a different way of working, and all of us have a different way of explaining things. And there is such a broad audience in Formula One, particularly in the Drive to Survive era that we're in now. So many people don't know all of this history, don't know all of the kind of the technicalities. And everyone needs to explain things their own way. Sam uses sticky up bits. I've spent the past 20 plus years trying to create names for things, so that when I say the side pod vein, everyone knows what I'm talking about, even if it's just made up. I mean, I probably have been guilty of actually naming quite a few of the things over the years. I think the double diffuser was probably me as well. So I think we've all got different ways of explaining things, and that for us that is the challenge. My career outside of Formula One has been very much about trying to explain technical things to non-technical people. I worked a lot in IT. And I think the other thing is because, I've been doing this for quite a long time, but social media and blogs and things kind of came in halfway through that, a bit more than and getting instant responses from people, instant questions actually helps you explain things in the first place, because you know that everyone is going to ask, is that legal, or who's doing that, or there's always lots of follow-up questions. So I think you kind of find your own tempo for explaining things. Sam keeps things quite simple, although he is he has qualifications in motorsport engineering. He's worked in the industry himself. Equally, Albert has a way of explaining things which tends to be showing parallels by putting a light bulb inside a crash helmet and showing how a crash helmet works. It doesn't shatter the light bulb. But he was a mechanic in Formula One, and is an engineer and a mechanic in his own right. I am somewhere in the middle. I like to still keep things quite I think I keep things still quite technical. I'm not trying to dumb it down or, wave bits of cheese or children's toys around. That's not how I like to do things. I like to be able to either draw them or show a photo with arrows to explain what's going on. That's the way I communicate. And that hits, that works for some people. And I'm sure the level of technicality I get into is too much for some people, but equally people, particularly on aero, which is, it's quite a subjective subject about how it works and how you explain it. You can explain the same solution in lots of different ways, and you probably could all be right, but you just got a different viewpoint on it. So, maybe the more technical people sometimes don't like it, but I know certainly from working with people within the sport, the designers, the people that supply, bits and pieces into the sport, appreciate the work I do and give me lots and lots of help. And I suppose at the end of the day, we're all finding our target market, and some people can understand it and some don't.
Oh, we love geeking out, so continue doing what you're doing and keep putting out that amazing graphical content. And you've laid a brilliant lead on for what I wanted to ask next. Is you had this amazing thread about Gearbox regulation changes coming into 2022, and like how pictorially you've showed how homologated it's becoming. What I want to ask you is, mid-season's approaching in 2 races where these teams now get to choose how they want to change up their gear ratios. What's the talk of the town in the paddock, and like what's happening, and what do we expect going into the latter half of the year where teams now make changes to their gearboxes?
It's interesting. I was thinking about that the other day while I was driving on the motorway and sat there in 6th gear and thinking, oh yeah, that's coming up, isn't it? I've heard almost no one comment on that we need to change our gear ratios. You've got to remember that these 6 gear ratios have now been in place for a number of years. The power units are well understood. The 8-speed gearbox is well understood. I think the question this year was how much drag the cars could carry, and therefore how much top speed could you get out of these cars with the wings, with the ground effect tunnels. And I think the team seems to be in quite a happy place. No doubt some teams will change. It'll probably be the teams that have changed philosophy in a big way. So I would expect potentially Williams would be in that position, maybe Mercedes as well. And equally, maybe even someone like Ferrari that really came out with what was going to be a very low drag car, but ended up being, to get the downforce, they put on these big wings. So, you wonder where they are in terms of managing final drive gearing and the individual gears. So, I don't think we're going to see everybody change immediately. And certainly it would be, I think a lot of people get tricked into thinking, well, Monza's coming up, they'll change it now. But obviously that then means that they've got to carry those gears at Singapore and for, another year onward. So it's, I don't think it's going to be. I think the last time we had that may have been 2014. I think it may have been another one since. And there really wasn't a lot of shuffling around of gear ratios compared with what you maybe would have expected, which just goes to show how good these teams are at simulating this stuff.
Interesting. Okay. Well, all right. So as we're kind of coming to a end of the show, so there are a few questions left that we wanted to ask. One would be about the engine regulation changes that are coming up in 2026, and from what we have heard till now, there is a initiative to try and get to more sustainable fuels into F1. As well as from what I understand, apart from the engine changes, there are also some aero changes targeted towards trying to make the cars a little lighter and smaller as, again, to improve racing. So yeah, please give us some inside scoops from what's upcoming.
So, the immediate thing really, we've got regulations for next year, 2024, 2025, and they're going to keep basically the same cars. There are a few changes. Tire warmer blankets will be banned in 2 years' time, or a year and a half as it is now, which I think is long overdue and is good. Pirelli and the teams are all getting themselves ready for that. It's not going to come as a massive shock to anybody. Right. Not much else is really going to change. But then you have this sustainable fuel, this e-fuel, whatever you want to call it. That will be coming in much sooner And I think that is a positive step on one hand, because, what don't use fossil fuels. You can make it, sustainably, ethically, without burning loads of energy. So, we should do that anyway. I think my only concern about that is that it still produces tailpipe emissions, so they are reduced. And that does potentially lock us into combustion engines going forwards a lot further, which I'm not so thrilled about. And then you come to 2026 when you have the big regulation changes. So there'll be two areas of this. We'll take the engine first. So there'll be the sustainable biofuel. They're going to completely change the engine regulation. I say completely change. They're going to take a knife to them, and we're going to probably lose the MGU-H, which is the hybrid motor generator, which goes on the turbocharger. And again, it's a very expensive piece of kit to develop, and you can see the problems that Honda in particular had in developing this. But the technology's out there. But I think, that could be transferable to another new manufacturer entry. It wouldn't be too difficult. But they're going to lose that. But what they will do is make the MGU-K, which is the old KERS, the hybrid motor that actually drives the car, much more powerful. So if we think back to 2009, we had, 90 horsepower, 60 kilowatt motor, which wasn't a lot. 2014, they effectively doubled that. So you now have 160 horsepower, from the hybrid system. But when you look at an engine that's kicking out completely over 1,000 horsepower, that 160 hasn't changed in a long time. In fact, by then it'll be over a decade. So it's long overdue. So they're now talking about taking up to about 350.
Wow.
Okay.
We're talking about a double treble of that output, which means that the physical motor has to be bigger, the battery may have to be bigger. But at the same time, the engine, the V6 engine, the combustion engine, will produce slightly less power. So you'll still end up with 1,000 horsepower race car, but more of it will be coming from recovered energy, which for me is where we should be headed towards. They should be making that motor smaller and smaller and less powerful, and recovering as much as you can get out. But there will also be some other cost-saving changes, which would probably be that the crankcase, the bottom of the V6, will be a spec part or a spec design. Teams would just end up developing the cylinder heads with all the clever combustion that goes on inside it. So I think that's where it's going. And as a stepping stone, I think that's good. But I think the sport does need to be looking more at 2035, 2040. Is what is the world going to look like in terms of engines, ways of powering cars there? What is the final drive options? But I think they could be a lot more creative with that and open up some really exciting development opportunities that just doesn't seem to be discussed at this stage, certainly not openly. And then the other regulation changes will come down to the chassis. So Formula One cars currently weigh 784 kilograms, including the driver. You've got 110 kilos of fuel on board. They're 3.6 meters long as a maximum, which makes them 5.6 meters long in total, which is
huge.
I'm not worried about the width, because Formula One cars have effectively always been 2 meters wide, apart from that little brief time where they were slightly narrower in the late 90s, 2000s. So they do need to be made shorter. They need to be made lighter. And they need to look at the sustainability of the car. So that's what they're looking at. So the cars will be short. You could easily cut 50, maybe even 60 centimeters out of the wheelbase of a current Formula One car without really compromising the mechanics inside. It would certainly compromise the aero, but who cares? That's right. That's the team's job. Taking weight out is a lot more difficult, and a lot of that will have to come from the power unit, because surprisingly, cutting even just 10 centimeters out of a Formula One car doesn't save you a lot of weight, because a lot of that is just kind of stretching the car out. It's not packed with components. So, 10 centimeters might mean 5 kilograms. So making them shorter will save some weight, but it's not really bringing them back into that kind of sub 700 kilo range. And then with some of the clever stuff, now I've always advocated bringing active suspension back in a controlled way. That's that's been spoken about and has been parked for the time being, but they're now talking about active aero. So if you think now, active aero is DRS.
DRS.
Yeah.
So the car for the whole lap will carry the wing that it needs to get around the 8, 9, 10 corners, which means on every straight that you don't have DRS, you're carrying that wing and you're burning fuel, just carrying that wing through the air. And as you can see, when DRS is open, the drag that the rear wing has is enormous. So the theory would be is that you will have some kind of active aero. So the rear wing would probably be closed most of the time, come up for corners. The same with the front wing. And drag is produced from the brake cooling ducts, the side pod inlets as well. So these may all have some kind of flap or louvers over them, letting the air in when you need it and not when you need the air out, as long as there's some kind of safety control that if anything fails, the wing comes up and everything opens.
Interesting.
So that would really save a huge amount of fuel and energy around a lap that is literally wasted. You can't recover that energy. It's not like with the engine. It's not kinetic energy. It's just drag. So, you potentially can make the car lighter because you're carrying less fuel to last the race and stuff like that. So it's, that's the kind of direction that I know that they're heading in for 2026.
I don't think anything can follow that level of detail, insights, explanations. Folks, I hope you've had fun. I hope you've had the level of insights that, you were hoping to get when you read the title. And all in all, I hope, Craig, Scarb, you had fun on the show. These are your regular hosts signing off. Off to Craig. Take us away.
Well, this has been Craig Scarborough at scarbstech. I hope you enjoyed listening or watching to all of this. I got some insights into Formula One. Keep watching. Please follow me on social media or on F1 TV, Driver61, whichever, if you find on YouTube. And just keep watching F1, enjoying the racing. And thanks for joining.